you everyone for coming along this evening and joining us. So I want to talk to you tonight about what the numbers mean, to you, what I do, how I do it, and everything that's going along on that front. So start off with a little bit of housekeeping. If you have any questions as we go along, I would rather they were posted in the Q&A section, which gives me an opportunity to see that you've got questions. If I can answer them as I go along, if I think that is relevant, I will answer them as I go along. Otherwise, we are in a situation where, just going to turn that off because that's going to keep pinging at me. Otherwise, we're in a situation where if people put stuff in the chat box, and I'm quite happy to see stuff going on in the chat box, I might miss it. I might not be able to answer it at the time. So as we go through, I want to try and answer the questions for you. I've got a nice photo of me with the VO2 master on there. I was hoping to start the presentation with a face mask tonight, and I completely forgot to do it. And it's behind me. It's not in the room that I'm in at the moment. So what do the numbers mean? I want to just go through a bit of background and tell you where we're coming from. So hopefully now everyone's found out who I am. I won't go through this detail. You can find all about me on the website. So sportstest.co.uk, I've got a bit of a blog on there about who I am, what I've done, what my background is. And again, I pretend to be an athlete, and that's the bit that's at the bottom. But really, the crucial bit is the one before the bottom. So I undertake fitness testing and coaching for athletes of all levels, not quite right across the globe, but certainly in the UK. I've got quite a few of my very nice Nigerian clients. I head to the Channel Islands on a regular basis. I've got clients in Spain that I work with. So, you know, I'm all over the place. You'll find me in a number of different places. Doesn't matter what we put in here, the word cycling, the word swimming, the word running, the word triathlon. That's the easy bit. Going out on your bike, going out for a run's an easy, but it's getting faster that's hard. And it's how we get faster effectively. And that is tonight what I want to really try and talk to you about. The good news for you guys tonight is that I haven't got thousands and thousands of slides. I've got a short number of slides, and I should, in theory, be in a situation where we should be able to get through all of this within about half an hour to 40 minutes. And it really just then depends on how many questions we get as we go along. So as I say, please feel free to shout if you have questions as we go along. I'm hoping that there'll be a lot of information you want to take on board this evening. And as a result of that, we also will be posting this on YouTube. I've forgotten where I'm posting it, on YouTube. So the YouTube video should be up in the next 24 hours or so. Obviously, if you're watching this on YouTube, you've already got it there. Again, hopefully, if you've not seen this, please go back to my videos that are on YouTube over the last couple of weeks. Levi is not getting audio. Is anyone else getting audio? Dave, have you got me on audio? We have some problems going on this evening. Let me just find out what's going on. Okay, Darwood, good to hear you. Levi, good stuff. Sorry, we're having some issues here. Let me just say, okay, someone's on. Sorry, we're having a bit of a nightmare this evening. Technical issues. Richard, thank you very much. It sounds like everyone else apart from Levi's got audio, so I'm going to press on. Levi, it might be an issue at your end, and if it is, unfortunately, you're probably going to have to watch this back over YouTube in the next day or two. I have also had problems where people are messaging me and saying they can't get on, so I can't be dealing with that at the moment, sadly. So I'm just going to press on, and hopefully people can come along and find me without an issue later on. So over the last couple of weeks, I've gone through a number of different things, and I've actually looked into this in great detail. And really what we're trying to do is we're trying to look at you, the athlete, and we're trying to get a much better understanding of how we can get better competition performance from you. And in order to do that, we need to make sure that your training is going well. And in order to make sure that your training is going well, right, we are having issues. Right. Fudge is the word that I need to say to people. Please bear with me one moment, guys. Please bear with me. I'm going to try and send a few people. Right. Okay, apologies. There's people struggling to get on, so I'm not sure what's going on. I'm having all sorts of messages. I'm going to ignore my phone. I'm going to focus on you guys for now. Right, okay, we are in a situation then that over the last couple of weeks, I've looked at this. I've looked at you, the athlete. I've looked at how we improve your competitive performance, and it's all about getting the training right. Now, if the underpinning nutrition isn't right, we're not going to get the training right, and so on and so forth. But all of this today is about getting this training right and how we get the most from you on competition day. And on competition day, it's about pacing, it's about nutrition, it's about making sure you've done the training, making sure you've done the background. And again, I go through this factor here that says, right, okay, we've got you as being this performance car here. How do we get the most from you as this performance car? Well, again, the crucial thing here is looking at this engine size, type and tuning. And there are other factors that come in, our fuel, our weight, our efficiency, our technique, reaction time, psychological status. But the underlying factor is really this one here. It's that engine size, type and tuning. So again, I'm not going to go into this. I've gone into it over the past couple of weeks. But it's all about you understanding your priorities and understanding what you have to do in order to get operating at the highest possible level. And this is where we're going to go heavy and we're going to go scientific. So I'm going to try and slow things down just a little bit now and say, right, okay, what we're looking at, we really need, and we've got a number of different factors on here. We've got our different energy systems and what availability of energy we've got. So we've got simple ATP system, the energy that's stored immediately in the muscle, and you get a maximum burst from that immediately. But by about 2 seconds, that is dropped off completely. So that's the acceleration. That's the me getting out of my chair. That's the acceleration. That's the power that puts down in the first fraction of a second that gets you going when you exercise. If that exercise intensity is of a shorter duration, so up to about sort of 6 to 10 seconds, we can now look at ATP, adenosine triphosphate plus phosphokeratin system. And as you can see here, that peaks somewhere about 4 to 6 seconds. But by about 9 to 10 seconds, you've lost all your energy from that. Then we've got our true lactic acid system, and what we can do in terms of buffering, we've probably got about 45 seconds, and by about a minute, we've dropped off. But from here, we're then looking at the aerobic system. So anything over a minute is predominantly, not exclusively, but predominantly aerobic. And again, that depends on the sport you're doing, the discipline you're doing, and how we balance that. So as I work predominantly with endurance athletes, I'm really looking at what energy systems we can get here from your aerobic system. And how does that work? Well, we're trying to get oxygen into the body. And again, it's not the most simple of schematics, but if you can understand what's going on here, and I've pulled schematic up. So V stands for volume. So the V dot is the minute worth of oxygen uptake. So oxygen from this atmosphere outside into the lungs. So the air goes in and the oxygen gets transferred from the air that you breathe into the lungs. From here, the lungs transfer that oxygen into the blood, and the oxygen is then transferred around the blood using the heart as a pump, and it gets taken into the muscle. Muscle contracts, works with the energy, and your output is carbon dioxide that then is shunted around the body by the heart. Carbon dioxide goes back to the lungs and then gets breathed out. And what we can see if we look at it up here in much more of a schematic, the oxygen goes in, inspired air takes the oxygen into the pulmonary circulation. The heart and the blood then shunt that into the peripheral circulation. That's now going, I didn't mean to, next slide there, didn't mean to shut it there. So we've got oxygen consumption, and the oxygen that's being consumed is being consumed by the mitochondria, and out kicks carbon dioxide, peripheral, heart, blood, lungs, and you expired. So that's the situation that we're looking at in terms of we've got to get this molecule of oxygen into the lungs, into the blood, around the blood, into the muscle contracts, you go forward. And that's the principle that we're trying to measure. So again, if I had it here, I'd be showing you a face mask goes on. I'm measuring this on a breath by breath basis. Every single breath that your body is doing, I'm actually measuring what is going on. Now we can get really complex with this, and I'm trying to be sensible with it so we don't overweigh you with too much information. But this is an endurance performance model that was put together in around about 1995. And what we're looking at is we're looking at 3 different functions: performance ability, functional ability, and then morphological components. And I've broken this down into slightly easier to view chunks. So performance ability, how quick, performance velocity, how quick can I go when I perform? Well, the first thing I'm going to think about is resistance to movement. So if I'm a swimmer and I'm working against fluid, there's lots of resistance to movement. If I'm a cyclist, depending on whether I'm sitting upright, whether I'm tucking down on my tri-bars, again, we can impact our resistance to movement here. As a runner, the resistance to movement might be the gradient that we're running up and body frontal surface area and wind. So we've got a direct component between how quickly you're going and to how much you're being slowed down. And the factors that are really impacting on our performance ability here is how much oxygen we can use during the performance and your economy of movement. So these are the 2 key factors that we're going to look at in terms of performance velocity. And if I flick back a graph, we can see here, performance velocity is then impacted by a number of factors. Sorry, performance oxygen uptake is impacted by a number of factors, and economy of movement is impacted by a number of factors. So that's the first thing, our performance abilities. Then we come down and say, right, we've got functional ability. So how can we actually cope? How does the body function? And in this case here, in this model here, they were talking about lactate threshold. And I look at this more as a metabolic threshold than a lactate threshold. And they look at what speed that your athlete is working at for their lactate threshold, and then what oxygen uptake we've got there. And then that oxygen uptake is related directly to maximum oxygen consumption. VO2 max is the term that's used as a brief mechanism. So those are the things that we're looking at in terms of how the body performs from a functional capability. So again, that's that middle block that we've got going on here. So we're looking at performance, then we're looking at function, and then we're looking at the way that the body is built. And if we look at that and we come through and go, right, we've got muscle capillary density. That's how much blood flow have I got going into each muscle? Then we've got stroke volume, which is how much blood can I pump for each pump of the heart. Then we've got how much aerobic enzyme I've got. So what is my muscle built up with? And then we've got other factors such as technique and muscle fiber type. Now, all of these have an impact, and I go back to this one here, all of these have an impact on your performance velocity. So again, if you listen to what I was talking about with FTP a couple of weeks back, to me, that's too much of a simple measure. We need to look at things in far greater depth. So, and again, going in and just having a VO2 max measurement isn't enough. We need to look at what's going on, oxygen uptake at threshold. We can't potentially measure these things without going really invasive, but we can start looking at performance oxygen uptakes. We can see what's going on in the field. We can make certain assumptions, certain measurements of economy and motion. And it's looking at how the function then relates to performance and then relates to capacity here. So at this point, and this is far heavier than I've done on any of my presentations so far, so I hope you're bearing with me, and please shout if you're not, and if you want anything me to go through anything. But we're looking at trying to get this performance model working as best as we can. Now, again, this economy of motion is really important to me, and I've actually used, so this is the endurance performance model from Coil 95, but I've actually pulled up something else where we actually look at performance and distance runners. Now, this is running specific, and what the focus here is that these authors believe that the performance and distance run is mostly about running economy. Now, in my mind, running economy is how much oxygen am I using to run at a given speed. Traditionally in lab methods, it's if you're running at 16 kilometers an hour, 10 miles an hour, how much oxygen you're using. But of course, I've got some athletes coming to see me that can't get to that workload, let alone sustain that workload. So I try and look at it relative to the individual. But what we can see here is if we focus on the main thing in the middle, we've got, running economy is about physiology. It's about what your VO2 max is. We've got how well you developed as a child and growing up. So again, there's evidence that suggests that if we had endurance phases as a child, if we had strength phases as a child, that will give you much better maximum oxygen consumption as you develop. Then we've got other metabolic factors, and then we've got right at the bottom here the influence of different running speeds. So what I tend to do is when I'm looking at what's going on here for running economy, I will tend to look at that from a variety of different run speeds. So as we'll chat in a moment, for a run test, as a submax test, I will tend to use something like marathon pace, half marathon pace, and then just probably below 10k pace. So we've got you just below threshold, and we will look at oxygen uptake for each of those. And from that, we'll have a much better understanding of what your running economy will be. Now, other factors that we've got, I'm sat here and I'm absolutely sweltering today. It's really warm outside. I think they said it's going to be 28, 30 degrees outside. So environment has an impact, and altitude and heat in particular. Then we look at training, so are you just purely training? Are we doing any plyometric work? Are we doing any resistance work? What training phase you're in? Whether you're incorporating speed, volume, intervals, hills, all of those, again, have an impact. And I was out running at 5:30 this morning, and the guy that I ran with, had come to see me a couple of months back. And one of the things I said to him, look, your endurance isn't good enough. And as a result, what I started to do with him was build up how much volume he's doing. So just by increasing his volume, we can now see that his heart rate is much lower for the speed that he's running at, 20, 30 beats lower than it was 2 or 3 months ago. And he's now able to run 100, 120 miles a week, injury-free. And actually, he went and did a 5K performance time trial last week and knocked a massive amount of time off and hasn't run that quick in 10 plus years. So, all of these factors come into here. Then we've got biomechanics, and this isn't really something that I deal with particularly, but there are things like flexibility. So these are the things that I always say to athletes, and I'm not particularly good at myself, and I'm perhaps not particularly good at following up the guys that I work with, but I try and put in some flexibility work, some foam rolling, some stretching in once or twice a week in a training plan. And then it depends on how well the muscle's doing, ground reaction force, mechanical factors, how long the limb lengths are, how good your turnover is, what your body position is, and how well your body is responding to what is elastic stored energy. So it's that explosive elastic component of the muscle. And then we've got factors of anthropometry. We'll get it out this evening. So limb morphology, how long the limbs are, muscle stiffness, tendon length. So again, that links in a little bit more with flexibility, but crucially for running, it's body weight and body composition. But a lot of these factors, I can cross out the word distance runners here, and I go, performance in distance cyclists, physiology, maximum oxygen uptake, metabolic factors. This would be different body positions. We'd look at environment, we'd look at training, we'd look at plyometrics, we'd look at all of this. All of these would be exactly the same for cyclists as they would be for triathletes. So there isn't really any difference between what we're trying to achieve with the group of athletes that we're looking at from this point of view. So we come on to the testing process and what the testing process gives us. And again, I want to try and give you quite a bit of detail tonight, but not absolutely fry your brains, because I'd rather people came back to me and sort of picked up on stuff here. So again, what we can see here, and this is from my trip to Lagos earlier in the year, and one of my Nigerian chaps on the bike, face mask on, volume, transducer here. So this is the measuring the volume of each breath. This sample line here is pulling off. My gas analyzers are actually tacked behind the laptop here, but this is constantly pulling off every single breath that we're measuring. And in this particular case, the rider is sat looking at his power output, controlling his ride speed, and I'm measuring what's going on here in terms of oxygen uptake. So you can't see it particularly well on this graph, but if I'm lucky, that will be the slide next. So we'll come on to this one here and I'll come back. So that's the graph that I'm basically looking at on that computer down there whilst the rider is focusing on what's going on. So if you're going to come in for an appointment, if you're going to come in for a test with me, how does the structure of that test work? Well, basically, if you're a cyclist or a runner, you're going to spend 2.5 hours with me in the laboratory. And what we tend to work on is the first 20 minutes to half an hour is an introduction. I want to know who you are, what you've been doing, what your goals and aims are. So I want to know where you've come from and what we're trying to take you to. And that just gives me a much better understanding so that when it comes to the testing process here, I can actually make sure that the testing that we're doing with you is at the right intensity, is right for you, as opposed to using a one-size-fits-all. That testing process will then take roughly around about an hour, and then we'll sit for another hour or so and go through feedback, and that's feedback specific to you and specific to what you're trying to achieve. So I'd say for a cyclist or a runner, that process would take 2.5 hours. If you're a triathlete, we would have same introduction. We'd test the bike first, we'd have an hour of feedback, then we'd test the run, then we'd have another further hour of feedback. So you're with me for 4.5 to 5 hours as a triathlete. This process here, it's easy for me just to show you this next graph. What we do, and this is a cyclist profile, and I haven't overlaid it on here, but effectively what we do is we'd increase your workload to gradually warm you off over the first 4 minutes, then we'd hold you at steady state for 5 minutes, then we build the workload for a further minute, and then we hold you at steady state for a further 5 minutes. Now, as I say, that 5-minute workload there should be very close to threshold, very close to an FTP value for you, just below, let's say, a 25 mile time trial pace. If you're a triathlete, if you're a cyclist. We then have a 5-minute breather, and then we do what we scientifically call an incremental ramp test. So we're constantly building the workload and building the workload and building the workload. As a runner, the slight difference here is we'd have 3-1 steady state run workload. So the first one would be 5 minutes at probably half marathon pace. Then we'd step up and have 5 minutes close to half marathon pace. And then we'd step up and have 5 minutes close to 10K pace. Then that 5-minute breather, and then the ramp test. And realistically, this is the profile that we should be seeing, regardless of who you are or what ability you are. But I start to look at different factors in this graph that tells me a bit more. Well, what we're trying to achieve though, and again, I'll flick back onto this, is start to show you some of the metrics. So I'm looking at oxygen uptake, this blue line here, and what we're seeing is our oxygen uptake is increasing, leveling off, increasing and leveling off. 5 minutes without the gas analyzers. And at this point here, if I was in the lab, I'd quite often draw and put a ruler through and go, look, your oxygen uptake is nice and linear. It's increasing in a nice straight line fashion. So that blue line is your oxygen uptake. V stands for volume, O2, oxygen uptake. As I showed you in the slide 4 or 5 minutes ago, V for volume, CO2, carbon dioxide. That's your waste gas that's coming out. On this heart rate, on this graph profile here, we've got a green line, which for some of you might not be green. If you've been in for testing, it might be a brown line. Colours have changed recently. And that green line is showing me what your ventilation rate is. So how much volume of air is being shifted in and out of the lungs. And I'm not particularly worried about that for now, but for certain tests, it can be a useful scenario. And then the other thing which I've got on this athlete, but I don't use it very often, is we're looking at this athlete's heart rate profile overlaid onto what the oxygen uptake and the carbon dioxide profile is showing us here. And the crucial thing is, if we look and we see what's going on, we've got a nice linear fashion here, and we say, well, the great thing is our oxygen uptake is directly related to either your run speed or your bike power output. So we should be seeing a straight line where we're looking at oxygen uptake and we're increasing the power output in a linear fashion. We should be getting a nice straight line response in what's going on in terms of your test results. And the reason for that is our oxygen uptake use, our VO2 increases because of an increased demand from the working muscle to produce power output. In order to go faster, you need to consume more oxygen at the muscle to burn the fuel, which is predominantly, but not exclusively, carbohydrates. And the faster you want to go, the more energy you need to break down, so therefore the more oxygen uptake we get. So again, if I flick back briefly, what we see is if I look at that blue line there, which is our oxygen uptake, that is going up in a nice straight line fashion. This is increasing, leveling off, increasing, leveling off. So we've got a direct relationship between your oxygen uptake and your workload. Then if we look at your oxygen uptake and your heart rate and oxygen uptake are also related. Now, as you need more oxygen to supply the working muscle, the heart has to pump faster to deliver more oxygenated blood. So again, if I flick back to what's going on here, what we're seeing here is that as this oxygen uptake line is going up, we can see this heart rate's going up and it's leveling off, and it's leveling off. As the oxygen uptake's going up, so is the heart rate, and then they're both leveling off. And although they're not going up at the same gradient, we can see that that is going up in a nice straight line fashion there, that oxygen uptake. On the heart rate for this guy here, there's always some small fluctuations, body position, what have you. But what we're also seeing here is we're seeing a nice linear increase in what's going on from that point of view there. So what we've got is, instead of you going out for a run or a ride with anything from 10 to 20,000 pounds worth of gas analyzers on, we can actually see in the lab and we can relate that back to your heart rate. The problem is, unless we've got that data to start with, I can't stick a finger in the air and guesstimate it. So, you know, it is important that if we're trying to predict some sensible training zones for you, and we're trying to look at your strengths and weaknesses, I can't just do it by looking at heart rate training data or power outputs or run speeds or anything like that. We need at some point to get some lab data or some true physiological data in order to be able to get a much better understanding of where you are in terms of your performances. So what do we learn? Okay, first thing we learned, number one, up here. What's going on up here? The peak of the test here. That's oxygen uptake, that's heart rate, and also I've got a power profile with that as well. So what I'm looking at here is we're looking to say, right, we can look at your VO2 max. Your VO2 max is that peak value, this one up here. So for this particular athlete, and this guy was about 75 kilos, his VO2 max is just over 5 litres a minute. Now, we reference that back to body size and body scaling. So we give you a 55, a 60, a 35, a 20, whatever it is. The higher that oxygen uptake is, the bigger the capacity to take on and use oxygen. But the secondary factor is relating that to body size, we've then got a much better understanding of what your endurance capacity is. So knowing that VO2 max, knowing that oxygen uptake, VO2 peak is absolutely critical for us. The better it is, the happier we are with what's going on. At the same point, we've also got a measurement of peak heart rate. Now, I'm not so fussed about peak heart rate, but there are some people that use peak heart rate for training zones. Again, there are some people that like to represent, and I do look at this, is what percentage of your peak heart rate, what percentage of your VO2 max can you hold comfortably? Because once we've got that ratio of where your peak is and where you're comfortably able to sustain that, that gives me a much better balance of how much anaerobic capacity we've got and how much aerobic capacity we've got. So again, that gives me a much better understanding of where the balance of your fitness comes from. We've also got peak power output or peak run velocity, and then allied to that is peak power to weight ratio. So the more power you can produce aerobically, the faster you can go. The more speed you can produce aerobically, the faster you can run. And then in terms of power to weight ratio, that also then impacts on your ability to accelerate, your ability to climb. So from the peak point of view, what we're looking at is these data points up here are telling me an awful lot about your performance capacity, your performance capability. So what can we achieve at peak? Now, there are many institutions that I've come across over the years who will just do a VO2 max test and they'll give you your peak VO2. In one sense, that's useful, but it's like going and buying a car and the car salesman just saying to you, well, look, this car does 100 miles an hour, that one does 105, that one does 83. It tells us one data point. It's much like I was saying to you a few weeks back, knowing an FTP value gives you one data point. In my mind, that doesn't give you enough data to build and structure your training and your training plan from. So we need to look and see how can we improve things. So we now look at what's going on here in terms of this threshold point. And what we've got, and I haven't really gone into this in any detail at the moment, but as I said to you before, as you're exercising, you need to take up oxygen to get to the muscle, to burn the fuel, to get you to move forward. Now, there's a balance in fuels that your body uses. Your body uses predominantly carbohydrate, but not exclusively. But it will also burn some fat as a fuel. It's very, very rare that unless you're doing very low intensity exercise and you're trained to really fat metabolize, that most people, while they're doing some form of exercise, will burn a small amount of carbohydrates. But I've come across very rare cases with people who almost exclusively at a low intensity will burn fat and very, very little carbs. But in this situation here, what we're looking at is when this oxygen uptake line is above the carbon dioxide line, so the blue is above the blue is above the red down here. We're looking at a situation in this case where an athlete is burning fat as a fuel and carbohydrates. And the ratio of how much fat they're burning to carbohydrate is determined by how far these two lines are apart. Now, if I'd done a sensible job tonight, I would have brought a different graph along and posted a different graph up and shown you somebody that's got a clear distinction between those lines and someone's got a minimal distinction between those lines, so you can see what's going on. But again, one of the things that I will see over time is actually where we see this metabolic threshold taking place. If I've got someone that's training well, that's developing their endurance capacity, what we will see is we'll see that crossover point here shifting across to the right. So they're actually now at a higher power output, but they're still working aerobically. They're still at that threshold point. So for me, knowing where this threshold point is, it tells me a couple of things. I can look at what your heart rate is at that threshold point, and I can use that then to determine your training zones. I can look at this metabolic threshold point, and from knowing this metabolic threshold point, I can look at the point before you're going to start going anaerobic and burning through carbohydrate really, really massively. So again, it gives me an understanding of what you can sustain for a longer period of time. And knowing that, and knowing sort of what's going on down here, and knowing what the balance is from, you know, the aerobic side of things to the anaerobic side of things, I get a much better picture of the athlete. So I will tell you, the athlete I'm looking at here is was a national level rider. He was riding at the time for a GB Pro team and was riding on the national squad as a cyclocross rider. And what I can see very clearly here is he's got a great anaerobic balance, but he's got minimal aerobic base. I know he was on before, Dave Hathaway. I'm assuming Dave is still here. Now, this profile for somebody like Dave is completely the wrong thing. If you're going to go and do double Ironman, triple Ironman, you need to be going all day long, all day long, all day long, and we want to see massive amount of daylight down here. We want to get to that anaerobic threshold point, and you want to stop about here. You don't want this max capacity. But because this guy was racing, a road racer and cyclocross, he needed a massive amount of anaerobic capacity. And so we can see that here is the balance between the aerobic side of things on the left-hand side of the max and the anaerobic side of things here. He's got a great anaerobic capacity. But one of the things I did with this rider was saying, well, actually, although your anaerobic capacity is great, down here, your fat burning is not phenomenal and your aerobic base isn't good. So we can send you away to go and do more endurance training. And as a result of that, his performances actually were enhanced. So again, rather than just taking a generic, you need to do endurance, you need to do threshold, what do I do to improve my threshold, my FTP? We can take a view of a rider that's specific to that rider or that runner or that triathlete, that swimmer, and say, right, what do you need to do to improve and enhance and boost your performances? So I've gone the wrong way on here. So this is the threshold point here. I've gone backwards. So number 2, threshold point here. And what we're looking at is says where these two lines cross over before the athlete is going anaerobic. And the athlete's going anaerobic because we're forcing out excess carbon dioxide for a linear increase in oxygen uptake. And occasionally what we will see is we'll also see this green line here, and we might see an inflection point. We haven't seen it for that this particular cyclist. And again, we've got that threshold point here. So what we're learning from that threshold point is we're looking at where your metabolic threshold is. We can then calculate speed and power at threshold. So what pace you can maintain for a 10 to maybe a 50-mile time trial on a bike. Again, a sprint, an Olympic distance, and a half Ironman race. But more importantly, I use that to measure and determine your training zones. So again, rather than going stick a finger in the air and guess these things, we can actually give you accurately determined training zones to make sure that your training time is not wasted by knowing truly where your threshold is. And again, if you think you can do that from an FTP test, please go back and listen to the seminar that I did a couple of weeks ago about the value of just doing an FTP test. But the third thing that I look at, and again, the comment that I made before is that, lots of people, lots of labs will do a VO2 max test, but they won't look at what's going on down here. It's from down here, I can see how much fat burning is going on for this particular athlete and where they are at threshold capability. So what we're trying to assess here is we're trying to assess how much carbohydrate metabolism is going on, how much fat metabolism is going on, that aerobic to anaerobic balance. And I can also use those values to look at either efficiency and or economy. So if I've got a power output because you're a cyclist, or if I've got a run speed, from a runner, I'm looking sort of more of an efficiency, but I can look at a metabolic economy by knowing what your power output is, how much oxygen it's costing you to go at that particular pace for what we're looking at. So let me just flick back and look at that quickly again. So what we're trying to ascertain here is by looking at where this oxygen uptake is in relation to the carbon dioxide. Again, I can see the balance between how much fat you're burning, how much carbs you're burning. We can look at that in terms of where that occurs as a percentage of thresholds and knowing the power outputs that the athlete is at. And again, we can look and say, well, where's your heart rate at threshold here? Where's your heart rate at threshold here? How can we change this? How can we change this over time? And again, I should have done and I haven't, so I apologize. I can show you examples where, you know, I've got an athlete that have a metabolic profile similar to this, and they come back for a retest 3-4 months later, and we can see that profile has changed completely because the training they've been doing has been at the right intensity and they're improving their fitness. And I can't bang on about this enough, that there are so many athletes out there training without knowing their training zones, or where they think they're doing easy endurance training are actually working far, far, far too hard. And that's a crucial factor. Crucial factor. I mean, the guy that I ran with this morning ran 16:50 for 5K a week ago, and we went out this morning. We ran just short of 20 Ks, and we ran for 1 hour and 40 minutes. So we were running what 5 minute 10, 5 minute 15 a K, and yet he's capable of running, you know, 3:30 a K pace at race pace. So we're running almost 2 minutes a kilometre slower for a long, steady, easy run. But again, it's about knowing where you need to be in order to get these values. And again, if we look at somebody that's maybe looking at a maffetone type approach to their diet, and they want to try and really enhance that fat metabolism, rather than just using the simple math of 180 minus my age, I've got a much better understanding about whether you're about an athlete that burns fat as a fuel, and actually how your heart rate should be, how high, how low your heart rate should be to really optimize this fat metabolism. And that brings us then on to the next point. So I don't think Kane is on tonight, but I've been doing some work with one of the sports nutritionists out there. And this is pulled from the profiles that I do, but really want to highlight what's going on. I haven't put any carbohydrate utilization on here, but the example that we've got here is on that 15-minute test. I'm looking at my athlete's heart rate, and we can see the heart rate is going up and up and up and up and up. And for this particular individual, we can see heart rate on the left-hand graph here. They're peaking, and this was just an incremental ramp test. A walk to run test with gradients going up. And what I can see in this example here, so it's a slightly different profile to the one that I use normally with my performance athletes. But what we can see is that heart rate is going up and up and up and up and up. And we've got this athlete peaking at a heart rate of 180. When we're looking at what's going on with their fat metabolism, we've got fat calories an hour here. We can see at the onset of exercise where the heart rate is actually really low, we've got quite substantial fat burning, but as the workload is going up and the heart rate is going up, we can see that fat burning is almost shutting down. So this athlete here, with a peak at just below 180, if we look at this time point here, and we're seeing that round about 115, that fat metabolism is shutting down completely. So if this athlete thinks, oh, I've got a max of 180, I'm 40-year-old, I can be training at a heart rate of 140 and burning fat. Well, let's look at heart rate of 140 there. 40 beats below max, there's absolutely no fat burning going on whatsoever. So again, the principle of just taking a math predicted number or taking a 220 minus my age and working at 70% of it, you're wasting your time. We need to see what's going on in this metabolic profile. Now, I can do this similar metabolic profile using these same data values, or we can actually make it specific to you. So if you're not an endurance athlete, but you want to look at burning fat, you want to look at reducing your body weight, we'll follow a profile like this. And in this particular case, for this individual here, what we're looking at is this quite early into exercise. We're looking at, we've got peak fat metabolism here, which corresponds with this particular individual working at a heart rate of around about 98 through to about 102. So that's a heart rate of around about 100 versus a max of around about 180. And when we start getting to this point here and we're starting to see massive shutdown in fat metabolism, you know, the fat metabolism is still relatively high, but you can see it's dropping and it's on its way down. That's occurring at a heart rate of no more than 120. So again, that's 60 beats below the maximum. And this test here wasn't from a 60-year-old. This test was from somebody that's reasonably well endurance trained and was in their mid-30s. So it just shows us the sort of profile that we need to look at. So if we're looking to achieve fat metabolism, if we're looking to reduce your body weight, or you're looking to build your endurance, it's really crucial that we look at these sort of things in this sort of profile. Again, I want to go on to the fat use, and this is an example. I've just literally pulled some data so that don't quite relate back to the graphs that I've just shown you. But for this particular cyclist here, we had power output 135 watts, oxygen uptake was 2.18 litres, and carbon dioxide at that workload was 2.08 litres. So there's not a huge amount of difference between those two. But at this time point, this athlete was oxidizing 2.5 grams of carbohydrate each minute of exercise and only 0.1 gram of fat for each minute of exercise. When we stepped up to 180 watts, we've got 2.87 versus 2.81. So they're still aerobic, they're still below threshold. Those two lines, those two numbers haven't matched. And when you go anaerobic, that VCO2, that carbon dioxide production will be higher than your oxygen uptake. And we can see at this point here, we're now oxidizing carbohydrate at a rate of 3.6 grams a minute. And the fat oxidation is less than 0.1 of a gram of fat per minute. So you're going to have to exercise. If this guy was sitting, riding comfortably at 180 watts, they're below threshold, but they would have to be riding for hour upon hour upon hour to even get 1 gram of fat oxidized. That's a heck of a lot of training they've got to do in order to get any value to their training. So, you know, realistically, what's that? It's 0.1 of a gram. So you've got to do an hour of exercise to get a gram of fat burning going. It's you know, why? It's not the right thing. And we can see if you start off with a full glycogen store at 135 watts for this individual, he would strip out, if he's burning fat, burning carbs at the rate of 2.5 grams per minute, he stripped out his glycogen store in just over 3 hours. Where the exercise intensity steps up to 180 watts, he's stripped out his glycogen store, his carbohydrate store, in about 2 hours and 15, 2 hours and 20 minutes. So again, if I'm looking for an athlete to go longer, we need to be very, very aware of what's going on in terms of how much fat you're burning, how much carbs you're burning, and how long you can go before you run out of that fuel. And so we've got to try and shift the balance in the energy substrate you're using, or shift it towards burning more fat as a fuel, as an endurance athlete, as a long-term endurance athlete. It may be slightly different if you're, for instance, a cyclist that's racing in crit races or a mountain biker, but having a better aerobic capacity is really going to help you out. Now, of interest, and again, if you saw the nutrition presentation a couple of weeks back, what we're saying is that for each minute of exercise, you can consume about 1 gram of carbohydrate. So on the basis of this, if he's going for 200 minutes, you should be able to consume 200 grams of carbs. Let's give him another 80 minutes, another 80 minutes, and so on and so forth. And actually right down at the bottom, and I need to just move something out of the way because I can't see it. At this point here, he's got 331 minutes of exercise at this lower intensity. At 180 watts, though, he's only gone for 3 hours and 10 minutes. So that would just about get through, and 180 watts, it probably isn't quite the right speed, but that's going to get you through a 70.3 bike, but you're going to climb off the bike, you're going to have to run a half marathon, you've got no glycogen left. So we need to look at these numbers for the relevant athletes and say, how can we adjust? How can we change your training in order to maximize what's going on? Either in order to achieve weight loss by focusing and developing your fat metabolism, or by achieving a better endurance scenario so that you can go for longer and you can go for further until you run out of fuel. So, and I have already been 45 minutes, so I've taken a lot longer than I thought I would. So why test? Well, the testing highlights our physiological strengths and weaknesses. It gives me the balance between where your peak is, where your threshold is, what your anaerobic capacity is, what your aerobic base is, what your efficiencies are, what your economies are. So I can then profile endurance, threshold, peak, recovery, and I can profile you for what you're trying to achieve. And by knowing what your physiological strengths and weaknesses are, what you're trying to achieve, we can then make sure that your training is appropriate to you. And it's not just a generic, here's a plan out of a book, I'm doing X, I'm therefore going to go and follow this plan. It's specific to you, and it gives you the results that you're looking for. The next thing is it clearly defines your training zones. If I can determine where that threshold point is and what your heart rate and or power and or speed is at that threshold point, again, I can tell you zones that are right for you, as opposed to pick a finger out, pick a number out the sky, or take a predictive 220 minus my age, or do a guesstimation of FTP, and then looking at what heart rate or power is doing there. So again, I'd like to be able to get a much more definitive understanding of what's going on in terms of your training zones to get the most from your training. But of course, more importantly, and I didn't show you the examples of this, where an athlete comes back and retests over time, I can see changes over time. I can see how we can enhance fat metabolism. I can see how we can improve efficiency and economy. I can see how VO2 max, peak power output, power to weight, peak running speed, all change over time. So I've got true indications that things are doing what they need to be doing. So again, we use all of that. Training program design is to identify your needs. We can then use that to set objective goals that make sure it's taking you in the right direction. And we can target the adaptations you require with the specific training that you require. I keep it from a coaching point of view. I'm going to give you a training regimen that gives you overload but recovery, but also tries to keep it interesting and challenging for you. And then again, we come back to the testing, either the testing in the laboratory or doing certain scenarios out in your training where I can objectively evaluate your progress. And by doing that, you're going to get the most from your performances. So just as a finishing off, training books, yep, great stuff. If you haven't bought one already, make sure you do. Next slide that we need to look at there is what we've been talking about for the last 45 minutes, is that physiological testing. To me, the physiological testing is crucial to you going faster. So it's not about just going out and training, it's about training smarter rather than training harder. It's getting the most from your training time. If you've only got 6 hours a week to train, let's get the most from those 6 hours. If you've got 20 hours a week to train, let's get the most from those 20 hours. Let's make sure you're recovering when you should be recovering, pushing when you should be recovering, when you should be pushing. It's getting the most from what you need to be doing. It's about then using that information for training program design, obviously with the coaching that I'm able to offer. And again, thank you all for your time this evening. I have gone my 45 minutes plus a little bit, and I'd like to invite you all to ask me any questions you've got, or vanish off and have your dinner and do what you need to. So please feel free to ask. If you found that useful, hopefully you did. The most important thing is that you book in for testing. Now, as we're sat here, I'm not sure when you'll watch this on YouTube, but as we're sat here at the moment, Boris says we still can't see you. So I'm working on scenarios that I can look to test you in the field over the next week or two if you need me to, and I can talk to you about pricing options of those if people want to. However, I'm hoping that the lab should be open by the middle of July, because the word on the street at the moment is hopefully a couple of weeks' time. Things should be easing a little bit, and I'm looking forward to hopefully seeing people as of July. But otherwise, if you want to thank me for my time, go and buy me a coffee, coffee.com/sportstest. Thank you very much, everybody. I'm going to stop talking now, and I shall wait for questions. And whilst I do that, I shall just go all the way back to the start. And I'll just remind you, it doesn't kill you. This little video that I played at the start, before we got everybody online, was a little video capture that was done for me. And it's a shame because if you go and search Vimeo for it, it's got the noise of a boiling kettle in the background. And it's sort of just as the athlete builds up and builds up and builds up. It doesn't kill the athlete. You know you've worked hard. In all the years of doing this, I've never had anyone fall off a treadmill, fall off a bike, throw up, but you know you're working hard. And within 2 or 3 minutes, you're talking to me normally, and you've recovered, and you're responding to me normally. So, good stuff. Okay, so there were people here. When you look at athletes, so Dave's asking, when you're looking at athletes training with the stock graphs and charts, what is the most important? I think the most important, Dave, is that they've got time in the training zone as best as they can. So we're actually hitting time in the training zone to make sure that we're using the training time as wisely as we can. So for your particular example, and you know I bang on about this all the time, is that if we've got somebody who is running quicker than they need to be, it's sometimes it's about going through the process of, we've got to get you used to, we've got to get you going on with what's happening on race day. And we've got to get stuff working so that you're responding as best as you possibly can. So it's all about getting that focus and hitting the training time, the training zone, and making the most of it. Hopefully that's answered that one. IB, thank you for the presentation, Coach G. Most welcome. Thank you for joining me from Nigeria. And thank you for that brilliant photo of you at Pit Stop in Lagos. So if you're in Nigeria and you've not visited Pit Stop in Lagos, why not? It's a fantastic place. Anyway, if training with power and doing threshold intervals, does it matter if we don't hit our threshold heart rates? No. So again, what I tend to do is I tend to look at different scenarios. So if I've set your training session as a power session, I'm not worried if the heart rates aren't getting to where they want to, if we're hitting the power zones. And sometimes with interval sessions, it's much easier to achieve a power because, and again, if you go back to the presentation you did a couple of weeks back, there's a lag in heart rate. So your heart rate might take 2 or 3 minutes to actually achieve sort of steady state, the element that we're trying to look for. So it then becomes quite hard. So if you're in a fortunate position, and I know you are, that we can look at what's going on with your power, it then makes it sensible that we're focusing and we're really getting what we need to achieve from a power point of view. Sweet spot in the tempo zone. So again, I tend to break things up and I tend to segment things. So sweet spot for me is stuck somewhere between sensible training down here at endurance and threshold training up there, and you're sort of bouncing around in the middle, and it's a nice place to ride. You feel good, but I don't think you're really focusing on either the endurance element of your training or you're focusing on the threshold element of your training. So again, I think some sweet spot training keeps you interested, but it's not an area that I worry about overly much. So hopefully that's responded to that one for you. Jacob, thank you for the presentation. Thank you very much for coming along. I hope you found it useful. Aduole, right, you did a test earlier this year and you know what your training zones are. You'd like to ask if your heart rate zone is exact. So what I tend to do, so the tolerances that I will give you will be a 10 beat tolerance. So, and I would need to go back to your numbers from the test that we did. So I would tend to give you a 10 beat range that we try and achieve. So you've got that ability to bounce around, because you're not going to be able to hold a number absolutely perfectly. So I tend to have a 10 beat banding. So I'll have a 10 beat banding for your threshold, I'll have a 10 beat gap, and I'll have a 10 beat banding for your endurance scenario. So that's where we've got, and again, please, if you get the opportunity, go back a couple of presentations. They're all on YouTube. So YouTube/Sportstest. Go and find the session I did, and it's entitled FTP, and I can't remember quite what it's entitled with FTP. But if you can sit and listen to 45 minutes or an hour of me going through that, again, you get a much better detailed analysis of what we're doing with the zones and where those zones are coming from and how they relate. And so we'll see, you've got from your threshold upwards is your max training, then you've got a 10 beat zone from your threshold, then we've got what I call a mixed muscle zone, and then we drop down here for your endurance. So each of those are 10 beat zones. So if you go a couple of beats over, you're a bit more into that sweet spot, but it's not really working your endurance or your fat burning as well as it should. So it doesn't switch completely. You don't switch from one to the other. You've got this mixed muscle zone sweet spot, with a lot of riders call it. So if you want, please email me and I will dig out your file and I will just clarify what training zones that we need. So hopefully that helps. And potentially that seems to be the end of questions for everybody. If you'd like to jump onto either the website, so sportstest.co.uk, it has a link through to the portal where you can book a 30-minute consultation with me to answer any specific questions you might have. or feel free to just fill in a contact form and ask us any specific questions, and I will do my best to answer them. And I hope you found this evening valuable, and it's given you a bit more background information. So it's perhaps worthwhile going through this presentation if you have been in for testing already, with your result sheets, or if you are thinking about coming in for testing. Now you've got a lot more information that will give you about how we can help and what we can do for you. So thank you all very much for coming along this evening, and I look forward to seeing you hopefully in the lab or doing some field testing with you very, very soon. Thanks all.